You're standing outside in January, your breath is turning to fog, the wind is cutting straight through your jacket. And right in front of you is an Amish farmhouse, snow piled 2 feet high on every surface, chimney barely putting out a wisp of smoke, and somehow impossibly the family inside is sitting in their shirt sleeves. No furnace, no thermostat clicking on and off, no utility bill taped to the refrigerator, just warm air, warm floors, warm walls, and a heating bill that rounds down to almost nothing. I need you to stay with me here, because what I'm about to walk you through is one of those things that once you see it, you cannot unsee it. And once you understand why most people have never heard of it, you're going to feel something close to anger, because this was never hidden by accident. Picture this. You pull up to a farmhouse outside Millersburg, Ohio on a gray December morning. The thermometer on your dashboard says 19 degrees. You knock on the door, and when it opens, warmth rolls out at you like you just stepped into a bakery. You walk inside, expecting to hear a furnace roaring somewhere in the basement. You look around for vents in the floor, for radiators along the walls, for any of the equipment you've spent your whole life assuming was the only way heat happened. There's nothing, just walls, but not just any walls. One wall in particular, south-facing, painted nearly black on the outside, with a pane of old glass mounted a few inches in front of it. That's it. That's the whole system. That wall has been heating this home through Ohio winters since the 1980s. It cost the family less than $60 in materials to build. It has never required a service call. It has never needed a replacement part. It has never generated a single monthly bill. And somewhere in a federal archive, there's a government document from 1979 that explains exactly why it works, and exactly how any homeowner in America could build one. A document that was published once, never promoted, never updated, and then quietly allowed to disappear from every consumer guide the government ever printed. This is not a coincidence. And the Amish, who have been using versions of this wall since the 1860s, have known exactly what was happening to the rest of us the entire time. Let me take you back further, because this story doesn't start in Ohio. It doesn't even start in America. It starts in ancient Rome, where engineers building the famous bathhouses discovered that thick stone walls facing the sun would stay warm long after the fire went out. They didn't fully understand the physics. They just knew it worked, and they built accordingly. That intuition, that a wall can hold heat the way a cast iron skillet holds heat, was passed down through centuries of builders who learned it by hand rather than by textbook. Then, in 1881, a French inventor named Edward Morse sat down in Salem, Massachusetts, and did something nobody had done before. He tried to make it official. He filed a patent, number 246,626, describing a wall system that could absorb sunlight during the day and release that heat into a home for hours after dark. He described the dark surface. He described the glass layer mounted in front of it. He described the air gap between them that trapped solar energy like a greenhouse trapping summer warmth in the middle of winter. The patent was granted, and then almost nothing happened. The industrial world was busy falling in love with coal, with gas lines, with the promise that energy could be bought and delivered on demand. Why build a wall that worked by itself when you could sell someone a furnace and a monthly fuel contract instead? Morse's idea sat on a shelf for nearly a century. Then, in 1964, a French engineer named Félix Trombe revived the concept and built what became the first modern version of what engineers now call a Trombe Wall in a small mountain village in the Pyrenees. The homes he retrofitted stopped needing conventional heating even through alpine winters. Researchers flew in from around the world to see it. The United States Department of Energy funded studies in the late 1970s. Los Alamos National Laboratory ran controlled tests. A researcher named Dr. Douglas Balcom evaluated wall configurations nearly identical to what the Amish had been building from instinct and tradition for over 100 years. His results showed heat retention overnight of up to 87% on walls equipped with proper night insulation. The report was published. It's still sitting in federal archives with the document number DOE-CS 0127 if you want to go looking for it. It explicitly stated that retrofitted Trombe-style collectors could reduce annual heating costs in temperate climates by 40 to 70%, on a wall that costs less than the average American spends on 2 tanks of propane. And then, in 1981, the funding disappeared. The Reagan administration cut the Solar Energy Research Institute's budget by nearly 70%. The institute had been the primary federal body studying passive solar techniques. Within 5 years, mentions of passive solar retrofits vanished from federal homeowner guides. The research didn't stop because the technology failed. It stopped because the money stopped. And the money stopped because someone with more influence than a handful of researchers at a national laboratory did the math on what happens to a $200 billion a year heating industry when ordinary homeowners start warming their houses with $40 walls. Dr. Balcom, before he passed away in 2019, gave an interview in which he described his life's work on passive thermal mass as having been treated as a curiosity rather than a solution. He said the payback period on materials was often less than 2 winters. 2 winters. After that, every cold night the wall works, it's working for free. Here's the part that should genuinely make you stop for a moment. The Amish never needed a government study. They never needed a federal research institute. They had been building these walls since the 1860s, when communities in Lancaster County constructed their farmhouses with thick stone walls on the south side and learned, through generations of lived experience, that those walls held warmth in a way that thinner, cheaper construction simply didn't. They didn't give the technique a name. They didn't write papers about it. They called it building the house right. And when a man named Jonas Baer from Gordonville, Pennsylvania started working in the 1920s to adapt the concept for older houses already standing, houses built before the principle was understood, he did what Amish craftsmen have always done. He figured out how to make it simpler, cheaper, and more accessible. Attached a heat-absorbing panel to the outside of an existing wall and enclosed it with a salvaged storm window. No new foundation, no masonry work, no contractor. Just a panel, a piece of glass, and an air gap between them. Now let me walk you through exactly how this works, because the physics here is simpler than you might expect. And understanding it is what makes the difference between someone who tries this and gives up, and someone who builds it once and never looks back. Here's what happens. Sunlight hits the dark painted surface on the outside of the panel. Black or near black matte paint absorbs something like 95% of the solar energy that hits it, compared to a white surface that reflects most of it away. The glass mounted in front of that dark surface creates a trapped layer of air between them, a miniature greenhouse effect happening right on the outside of your wall. The dark surface heats up, the air in the gap heats up. And because you've cut 2 small vents through your wall, one near the floor and one near the ceiling, that heated air has somewhere to go. It rises through the top vent into your room. Cool air from your room drops through the bottom vent to replace it. A natural convection loop starts running. No fan, no electricity, no moving parts. Just physics doing what physics does. The wall absorbs heat all day. The masonry or dense material behind the panel stores that heat the way a stone holds warmth at a campfire long after the flames die down. As evening comes and the temperature inside the house starts to fall, the wall begins releasing everything it absorbed steadily over 10 to 14 hours. An Amish family of 7 in Lancaster County kept their entire downstairs between 68 and 72 degrees from November through February, using nothing but this wall and a small wood stove for the coldest nights. Their fuel consumption was less than 1 cord of wood per winter. The average American home burns through 3 to 5 cords, or pays the equivalent in gas, oil, or electricity. Here at Secret Vault, this is exactly the kind of buried practical knowledge we keep coming back to. Not because it's exotics, but because it works, and because the reason you haven't heard it from anyone else is worth understanding. Now here's the piece that most people who've tried to replicate a Trombe Wall get wrong, and it's the reason some of you may have heard of this concept before and dismissed it as underwhelming. There's a critical element that almost every modern attempt skips entirely, and it's what separates a wall that performs adequately from a wall that keeps working through the night. In March of 1923, a craftsman named Samuel Yoder sat down in Holmes County, Ohio, and wrote something in a plain builder's notebook that his great-grandson still has. On one page, alongside a simple sketch, Yoder described what he called the night cover, and what he'd figured out was this. A heat-absorbing wall works beautifully during the day, but at night, that same dark surface starts working in reverse. All the heat it absorbed during the day begins radiating back outward through the glass into the cold night air. By morning, without intervention, you can lose up to 40% of the heat you collected. That's why passive solar systems built without this feature tend to underperform, and why skeptics who've tried cheaper imitations walk away thinking the whole concept is overhyped. Yoder's solution was exactly what you'd expect from a man who solved problems with materials he had on hand. He built an insulated panel, straw and burlap sandwiched between 2 thin sheets of wood, and hung it above the heat wall on a simple rope and pulley. At sunset, the family lowered the panel down in front of the glass. At sunrise, they raised it. 2 minutes of effort. The wall behind it stayed sealed in its own warmth all night. With the night cover in place, overnight heat retention went from roughly 60% to over 92%. Yoder's solution was exactly what you'd expect from a man who solved problems with materials he had on hand. He built an insulated panel, straw and burlap sandwiched between 2 thin sheets of wood, and hung it above the heat wall on a simple rope and pulley. At sunset, the family lowered the panel down in front of the glass. At sunrise, they raised it. 2 minutes of effort. The wall behind it stayed sealed in its own warmth all night. With the night cover in place, overnight heat retention went from roughly 60% to over 92%. Modern materials make this even easier. A sheet of rigid foam insulation, the kind sold at any hardware store for around $18 per 4x8 sheet, cut to the size of your collector and mounted on simple hinges or hooks, does the same job. Drop it into place at sunset, lift it at sunrise. The family in Lancaster County that showed me their version had upgraded Yoder's pulley system so the whole operation took less than 10 seconds. Their wall, including the night cover, had been running continuously since 1987, 38 years of free heat. Yoder wrote his measurements in the language of a craftsman rather than an engineer, and there's something almost radical about that. He didn't specify thicknesses in millimeters. He wrote that the stone wall should be as thick as a man's forearm is long. He wrote that the air gap should be roughly the width of 4 fingers. He wrote that the night cover should be heavy enough that a child couldn't lift it easily, but light enough that a woman could raise it with one hand and a pulley. These are instructions written for ordinary people with ordinary tools. And they worked. Records kept by his wife Mary, now held at the Heritage Historical Library in Ontario, show that between 1924 and 1931, the family burned 43% less firewood than their neighbors of comparable household size. In a region where a cord of wood represented 2 days of physical labor to cut and split, 43% was not a footnote. It was the difference between a hard winter and one you barely noticed. Now let me give you the practical sequence, because information without a plan is just entertainment. Step 1. Find your south-facing wall. In the northern hemisphere, that's the wall that receives direct sunlight from roughly 9 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon on the shortest days of winter. Stand outside at noon on a clear day in December and watch where the sun hits hardest. That's your wall. Step 2. Measure it. You want at least 60 square feet of unshaded surface. If a tree blocks it, you either deal with the tree or you find a different wall. A southeast or southwest wall will work at reduced efficiency, about 30% less output, but it's still worth doing. Step 3. Source your mass. Concrete blocks, painted matte black work, salvaged brickworks, dense stoneworks, the Amish sourced material from collapsing outbuildings and abandoned fieldstone piles. For a retrofit on an existing frame house, a half-inch sheet of plywood or sheet metal painted with flat black high-heat paint, the kind sold for wood stoves and grills, about $12 a quart. Absorbs heat effectively and mounts easily. Let it cure for 48 hours before assembly. Step 4. Mount the panel. Attach wooden furring strips to your existing wall through the siding into the studs. Mount the painted panel to the furring strips, leaving a 3 to 4 inch air gap between the panel and your house wall. Then cut 2 small vents through your wall, roughly 4 inches by 10 inches each, one near the floor and one near the ceiling within the area the panel covers. Install simple metal louvers from any hardware store, about $8 each. These are the only cuts you make into your house. Step 5. Add the glazing. An old storm window mounted about 2 inches in front of the painted panel is ideal. Twin wall polycarbonate from a greenhouse supplier works. Even doubled clear poly sheeting on a simple wooden frame gets you most of the way there. The Yoder design used single pane glass with the night cover doing the heavy lifting, and it still hit 92% overnight retention. Step 6, and this is the one that matters most. Build the night cover. Quilted moving blankets sewn together work. Rigid foam board faced with fabric works. A simple wooden shutter lined with wool batting works. Hinge it at the top, weight it at the bottom, and rig a cord and cleat so you can raise it at sunrise and lower it at sunset. This single step is what separates a passive solar wall that performs from one that disappoints. Total materials for a wall section 8 feet wide by 6 feet tall, somewhere between $45 and $70 depending on how much you source secondhand versus new. Total tools required: a drill, a saw, a level, and a screwdriver. Total time to install, 1 Saturday afternoon. A retired electrician in Holmes County did exactly this on the south wall of his 1958 ranch house. He spent $43 on materials. That winter, his propane bill dropped from $280 a month to $96. He told the person who introduced me to this story that he felt like an idiot for waiting 40 years to do something that simple. Imagine this. You put your hand flat against the inside of that south-facing wall at 4 in the afternoon when the sun is already getting low. The wall is warm under your palm. Not hot, warm. Radiating steadily into the room hours after the direct sunlight has moved on. That's the wall remembering, exactly the way an Amish carpenter once described it to someone standing in a living room in Pennsylvania, slightly bewildered on a frigid morning. There is something deeply uncomfortable about sitting with the full picture of why this knowledge isn't everywhere. It isn't complicated. It doesn't require a construction background. The materials are available at any hardware store or salvage yard. A government report from 1979 documented its effectiveness in plain language. Researchers at a national laboratory confirmed those numbers in controlled tests. And somewhere along the way, the industry that profits from selling you heat every single month moved on to high-efficiency furnaces, then heat pumps, then smart thermostats. each tied to a service contract, each generating recurring revenue, each ensuring that your warmth remains something you rent rather than something you own. Nobody sat in a room and decided to suppress a notebook from Holmes County, Ohio. What happened was quieter and more systemic than that. Funding dried up. Consumer guides stopped referencing passive solar. Contractors never learned it because there's no margin in selling a $47 wall that lasts 30 years. And the knowledge retreated into the communities that had never needed the system in the first place. Communities that had been dismissed as backward for so long that nobody thought to ask what they actually knew. Here at Secret Vault, we've said before that the most dangerous kind of forgotten knowledge is the kind that got forgotten on purpose. This is that. Samuel Yoder wrote in his 1923 notebook, and this line has stayed with me since the first time I read it, "Men forget what their hands once knew." He was talking about a rope and a pulley and an insulated panel, but he was also talking about something larger. He was talking about the slow erosion of the understanding that warmth is something you can build, not just buy. That the sun rises on everyone, and a dark wall and a piece of glass and a blanket of insulation are all you need to decide that the utility company doesn't get a cut of your winter anymore. The families who've been doing this since the 1860s never let go of that understanding. They built their walls right. They covered them at night. They watched their neighbors pay for something they were collecting for free. And they kept quiet about it, not out of secrecy, but because nobody was asking. You're asking now. That's the difference. If you have a south-facing wall on your house, if the sun hits it unobstructed for 4 hours or more on a December afternoon, you have everything you need to start this weekend. Under $70, one afternoon of work. And by the third day, if you put your hand flat against the inside of that wall at 4 in the afternoon, you will feel it. Warm under your palm, steady, working. The knowledge was never gone. It was just waiting for people willing to remember it. That's what you just did.